Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you are watching this webinar. My name is Dave Nagel, and I'm very excited to share with my friends and colleagues in Visalia Unified School District that are going to be attending the upcoming Common Formative Assessment 2.0 Professional Learning with myself and Tremaine Nelson on June 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th. This webinar is just a quick overview of some of the actions that we're going to be taking place in, some of the activities, and what the whole process will look like to give you a chance to get to feel what you're going to get out of these 4 days, and any chance for you to think about questions or what you want to come to the sessions and be prepared to ask questions and just make it the best professional learning opportunity for you. We talk a lot about flipping the classroom. This is sort of flipping the professional development. So again, my name is Dave Nagel. I'm conducting this webinar, but my colleague Tremaine Nelson is going to be right alongside with me those days with the math teachers. And we've worked together already with some planning and making sure that we're aligned so that way the processes and things that we're talking about in both sessions really align with what's happening in Visalia, certainly with a math lens or an ELA lens. But Tremaine is very excited to connect with everyone as well. One of the things that we, I think, notice, and Tremaine and myself are very fortunate, we get around to a lot of schools across the country, and regardless of the state, province, or makeup of the district, one thing teachers have in common is that we are all time poor. And we feel very overwhelmed because there's a lot that's been put on our plates in the last half decade and decade and a half, and in the last few years with Common Core standards and some higher expectations, and just what seems like an overwhelming process to go through this thing on a daily basis of teaching. And so one of the things we're really hoping, we want to challenge you to challenge us, is that as we go through these days, you're seeing that while some of this might seem like hard work, it certainly will not only save us time in the long run, but maybe provide a more insightful opportunity as we are assessing and doing things with our students to know more that what we are doing is working. And so that's one of the things I really want to kind of impress on everyone, is that this is a difficult profession and is very often not given the credence and credit to teachers who work very hard every day. We want to make sure this gives you an opportunity to see the things that I'm doing on a daily basis with my students are providing me the most important information to make the best instructional decisions. Because we've all felt like this. My standing question is, if you've been teaching longer than a year, when did you figure this out? Was it on the second day of school or the third day? But we can't teach it all. So how do we make sure that what we are teaching and assessing well gives us, the teachers, the best information possible? And any quality assessment really comes down to these 3 points. What's my purpose? And then when do I have enough evidence to make an inference? And realistically, this is what happens to us each and every day with everything we do. We're driving to work and hoping to get there on time, and we pay attention to the GPS. We pay attention to the traffic. We look at the line at Starbucks and determine if we could get through that line and get there on time. And if not, we just go to the next Starbucks. But my joke there is we gather evidence to make an inference every day. Same thing should be happening in our classroom. So we first have to decide, what's our purpose? What's our main focus of this unit or this instructional piece or this lesson or this assessment that I'm going to put in front of my students? What was I really looking for? And does it give me the evidence to make the best inference possible? A quote from James Popham, professor emeritus at UCLA, and I often don't read any quotes if I'm presenting or even on a webinar, but I will with this one. But teachers use the test results in order to make inferences about their students' cognitive status. And once those score-based inferences have been made, the teacher then reaches instructional decisions based at least in part on those inferences. Educational assessment revolves around inference making. Everything we do is making inferences. Teachers walk in the classroom and they see 2 students and just how they're sort of acting and behaving, and you say to yourself, I'm not quite sure those 2 need to sit together today. So we do this all the time. We do it instructionally. We do it how we handle students' behavior. And what we want to work through the CFA 2.0 process is how to make sure that we are making the best inferences possible, because that's really what drives all of our decisions. So what's in it for me? And I always say teachers should ask this question. This is a fair question. One of the things that we're taking up through these 4 days is your valuable time. And we're going to make sure that we provide high quality professional learning. And actually, Tremaine and I will stress that point. It's not just professional development or training, it's learning. And you have to allow yourself to be a learner and feel like as you're going through these 4 days, you're not only walking out with a product, which you see in number 2, a completed formative assessment, but you've developed some learning to develop a deeper level of assessment literacy. We're really going to ask everyone to write their own assessment for one specific reason. The more we do that, the more we become better consumers of existing assessment items. And then we'll talk about how at the end of the day on June 9th, that is only the beginning of the conversation and what might you need for some ongoing short and long-term implementation into the 2017-18 school year and beyond. Everyone will receive Larry Ainsworth's Common Formative Assessment 2.0 book, which is now a bestseller at Corwin, and an extensive workbook that is full of resources that we won't use as a training manual per se. We're not going to go through page by page, but it's got a lot of information that we will utilize during the 2 to 4 days, but also information that you can use afterwards. So I want to highlight briefly the 10-step process and walk through a couple pieces here this morning or afternoon, whenever you're watching. But these steps are really what we're going to focus on those first 2 days. We're going to identify our priority standards, and we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of what work has already been done in Visalia and how we look at the priority standards as a whole as a guide for our curriculum and pacing guide, and what is vertically aligned through 6th, 7th, and 8th ELA, or from pre-algebra to algebra to geometry, so on and so forth. We'll unwrap them to identify what the standards tell us in terms of the concepts and skills and what they need to be taught at an accurate rigor level. We'll then determine what the big ideas and essential questions are, and then we will write our assessment. We'll create that post-assessment, what we want the students to be able to do at the end of the unit, including the scoring guides, and then take a look at what our pre-assessment might need to include. Some of you, if you're familiar with Larry Ainsworth's process, this was always embedded in his first CFA Common Formative Assessment work. But then on days 3 and 4, we're going to dig deeper into the unit planning. What are the learning intentions and success criteria that we want the students to be able to reach and make them not just student-friendly in terms of their language, but understandable so the students can understand how they are progressing throughout the unit. We'll talk about evaluating the items for quality, and those last 2 pieces, which I'm going to highlight briefly during this webinar, determining what are the learning progressions I should expect for an instructional sequence which aligns with our pacing guide and creates sort of an instructional unit that we're creating that goes beyond just the test or end of unit assessment. And then how will I plan for quick checks to check for learning that's happening along the way? And those really go hand in hand, and that really is something that can be embedded deeply into the PLC or collaborative process. Again, formative assessment, going back to James Popham, is a planned process. We're going to encourage all of the teachers or all the members to think about, if we're writing our assessment in June, this should be something that we should not plan to teach until maybe September and maybe even mid-September. Point is that we should work on our assessment over time, because the first time we go through it, they're in draft form. And if you're developing an assessment in September, it should be for December or January. So it's got to be something that's planned out. And James Popham would say it's better to have a poor assessment in the teacher's hands at the beginning of a unit than a high quality one that's developed halfway through, because you should start the unit knowing exactly what the target is, as should the students. And so we're really going to be excited that during these 4 days, and while it will be a lot of work, and I think at the end of the 4 days, we'll probably needing a break, but we've got a chance to go deep and not worry at the end of the days going back to our classroom and addressing some of the things that happen throughout the school year. We're going to have time to really put this together, and then have some time again for you to go back and revisit it before you implement it in the fall. I shared with you Larry's 10-step process, which at times seems overwhelming before you go through it, but I've simplified it here as well. We have our pre and our post assessment, and then throughout that unit, what are, for example, 3 learning progressions that we're going to check throughout the unit to know if students are making progress towards that. And we're checking for learning, not doing. We're checking at times, are students getting it? Not did they necessarily just completely get it? To make the right kinds of interpretations and adjustments. And many teachers who have gone through this process now have said this has saved them time to know that they can continue on with their instructional plan throughout the unit, because most of the students are getting it, and the ones that aren't yet are showing enough progress that I've got time to catch them up and to not be overwhelmed sometimes when not everybody is at the exact same place. So this is really, when we think of the assessments on the outside of the bars, those are important, but it's those things in the middle that have really empowered teachers as they're developing that unit of study to really feel like they're making the best adjustments. And sometimes that adjustment is to continue on with what was already planned, because there's no reason to think we need to get off course. One of the other things we'll talk about is developing the highway of assessments, because we have to have that system that aligns the standards, the assessments, the curriculum that we're going to utilize in the pacing guide, along with the instruction and how we analyze that evidence over time. And I purposely put data and evidence. Sometimes it is in the form of data where we're looking at the scores, But more importantly, it's along the evidence that students are eliciting in their exit tickets, in their day-to-day quick tasks and assignments, that we want to make sure give us the best information so we feel like we have that alignment. And there's the alignment that's in my classroom that aligns with my peers that are teaching the same course, and certainly there's that vertical alignment. And I think hopefully you will see some of the work that's already been done has really been a precursor and a catalyst that you've done in Visalia that's going to help make this work even stronger, but also acknowledging it's not going to be finished. And we're always sort of at a work in progress. Going back now to the 10-step process, one of the other pieces that's really powerful is we will spend time after we write the assessment looking at how we evaluate and revise our assessment items for quality, making sure that we have an alignment between the items and what we're hoping to assess in terms of the standard, but then also that we have that alignment back to the standard and that we're putting the level of established quality guidelines in place. Larry has taken the time to synthesize from James Popham and Rick Stiggins and a few others what really will help items give us the best inferences in terms of student understanding. And often it's a small tweak in terms of how we format it. And then we can take existing assessments and maybe make some tweaks with them, but we're not always starting at the beginning. We don't always have to create the assessment completely ourselves. I like to use the metaphor of Daniel LaRusso in Karate Kid, who didn't quite understand as he was painting the fence or sanding the floor what he was learning. So as we write and evaluate our own items, it helps us be so much better consumers of existing assessments. And then we will spend a little bit of time, and this is where it's important that we should align in California, for example, to Smarter Balance. In Illinois, where I do a lot of work, to align to Park. And that doesn't mean we're teaching to the test. What it means is we don't want some type of disqualifier, such as unfamiliar formatting or vocabulary, to get in the way of our students showing us what they really know and what we have taught well. It's no different than a coach who watches film and breaks it down to know, hey, here's what we need to be prepared for in that game. I'm still going to be a quality football or basketball or whatever my coaching sport is, but I'm going to make sure that I don't have a situation where my athletes, my students, are unfamiliar with something that I can easily prepare them for. So again, it's not teaching to the test, but it's making sure that we have that alignment. And then finally, the piece that, as I mentioned, will happen more on days 3 and 4, but developing that unit gets down into looking at the learning progressions and that instructional sequence. And the learning progressions have really been a missing link in a lot of our instructional sequencing and development. And what we have to understand and acknowledge at all levels, but specifically at the secondary level, myself as a former biology teacher, we can have an expert blind spot. We have forgotten at times some of the learning that we engaged in to get from point A to point B. But we'll look at what is a series of hypothesized events, learning progressions for a broader curricular aim, back to James Popham. And I mentioned I was a science teacher because when we use the word hypothesize, it's an educated guess. We've taught English and math before. We understand that there's a sequence that we should follow, but we have to acknowledge learning progressions are not always linear. Not all of us, any of us, are going to learn things at the exact same sequence. I often make the joke that it would be nice if all of our computers, the ones between our ears, our brains, were developed by Steve Jobs. They'd all be programmed the same. We'd all know how to handle them the same, but they weren't. They were developed individually in different places, and they all have a different processing system. So thinking about what those learning progressions are, and then what are some knowledge and skills that we're going to look for our students to get to that higher curricular aim. For students to be able to cite textual evidence, well, they're going to have to comprehend and analyze and differentiate between extraneous information and relevant information, for example. And we'll work through those. It's really a powerful experience. Most teachers say it's the thing that they haven't done enough of, and it really drives later maybe what we have to put in our pre-assessment. What are some skills that I need to check for early? Because if you don't have that, we're going to struggle throughout the unit. And if you have that for the most part, it's going to help me move on and know that I've got a pretty good chance with some foundational elements that are in place to get students from point A to point B. But then after we do that, what are those quick progress checks that we want to make sure we develop? The things that will help that fine-grained discourse, as Little mentions here. When we're in our PLC meetings, far too often those meetings become either data analysis where we're looking at scores, or we're trying to plan the next activity and we haven't really looked as much at the learning. So for example, when we develop quick progress checks, it's not just saying we'll give the students an exit ticket at the end of the unit. It's saying, here's the question we might put on the exit ticket, and what should we look for in the responses that would tell us that they're getting it? Teachers, as you know, collect those at the door, and we can make a quick assumption and inference about how the students are doing, and then take those exit tickets, with all due respect, place them in the garbage, and I've just graded my papers for the day. But what's critical was I was thinking ahead of what should I look for in the response, not just what's the question I should give them. And then bringing those students into that process to not only inform the instruction, but possibly, I made the comment a second ago, about putting them in the trash. I've seen teachers give that same exit ticket back to their students on a note card 3 days later and say, now respond on the back. And students see, wow, look how much I've grown and learned. And it really brings them into the assessment process. We're going to talk a lot about how that ownership needs to shift towards them, but they need the teachers to do that first. And it really helps gauge how all of our students are progressing. And are they getting it? Are they moving towards that standard that we're working towards? And then finally, that's where we revisit possibly that pre-assessment, as I mentioned, to where at times I might need to check for some foundational knowledge early on. Students who are writing an argumentative essay, I've had teachers many times say that at the end of the essay, students had some great sentence structure and punctuation and all those other pieces. But gosh, their argument didn't hold the water it needed to. So now I might need to early on really kind of check for my students understanding what's a solid argument versus what's an opinion that isn't really backed up. Which leads me to my last point when we talk about pre-assessments. And one of the things we all know pre-assessments do is they take up time. And so sometimes teachers feel if I give a pre-assessment and it doesn't give me information, it's not going to help me instructionally. Certainly that's the case. But I want to mention that there's different kinds of pre-assessments. There's the mere pre-assessment, where pretty much we give the same pre and the same post. Maybe we change the questions, maybe we change the numbers. We can actually implement a smart or a smarter goal and look for growth over time. You can give the same kind of mirrored pre-assessment, but maybe plan for if students ace the pre-assessment, how am I going to have a differentiated post-assessment? One thing I want to mention, though, and there's nothing wrong with having a mirrored pre-assessment, but I'm going to challenge us as Tremaine will as well. Sometimes that shouldn't be the default. What is that like, or aligned pre-assessment that doesn't assess the entire post-assessment concepts and skills, but it's about foundational skills? What's a set of skills or knowledge that I need to check early, and it's not going to separate into 4 groups. It's either you're going to have it or you don't. But then I can't necessarily, between the pre and the post, look for complete growth because I'm only checking for something small. But I could check between units 1 and 2. A lot of the standards, ELA, math, but I'm going to go to English language arts for right now. If we look at standard 1, reading language arts or informational text, that's not a standard we're going to be teaching or assessing just once. And so maybe we're assessing something about that in Unit 1, and then maybe Unit 3, we can look at growth, maybe not on the entire assessment, but look at these 5 or 6 items that related to complex characters in this story and how students responded a month later. What an example not only to demonstrate how students have been progressing, but how quality teaching and assessment has moved them forward. So we'll talk about how we look at our pre-assessments maybe differently, and what are those foundational skills that we want to check for early. So again, as we think about Larry's process, and we're going to walk everyone through it in sort of a framework and format, but as you go through it after that, you're going to realize hopefully that all of these processes here, it's not about these 10 steps in this order. They're all just good bread and butter practices. There's really nothing up here that's rocket science, so to speak. It's hard work, but they're things that we would need to have in that system. And why Tremaine and I are both very excited is we've got the opportunity over these 4 days to really go deep and to allow teachers to have time to work, to have plenty of work time and come back on Wednesday and Thursday and Friday after you've learned something and have a chance to apply it. It will be certainly at the end of 4 days, we'll probably have had all the assessment fun we can stand. But many times when we've done this work, we haven't had the chance to do it consecutively to where you really have a chance to go home every night, not necessarily any homework, but to clear your head and come back the very next day and get right back to work. So I left my email up. If you have any questions between now and our session, please don't hesitate to reach out. Tremaine will be the same with his working with the math group. And we're very excited to meet everybody in Visalia 2 weeks from today, actually, on June the 6th. Thanks so much. Have a great day.